He couldn't sleep. Mike's face stung from the gash and the stitches, and a pulsing ache radiated from the back of his skull. His knuckles were shredded, and his arm throbbed under the thick bandages. Whether he closed or opened his eyes, even his eyes hurt. The images were there, like grainy documentary footage, some of it in motion, some of it still. The weight of the revolver in his hand, the stock slippery from his sweating palm, the white-hot rage that catapulted him from that bench, the smell of grass and sweat and blood, handcuffs gnawing at his wrists, the shocked faces as reflections of maple trees slid over the cruiser's tinted windows. Whew. That's the start of Chapter 2 of Wilderness Therapy, a brand new book by Paul Cumbo. We don't ordinarily talk about fiction here on Boys, but this book is exceptional. It's written for boys by a longtime teacher of boys, and it tackles issues that are familiar to every boy: loss, failure, grief, family, and rage. Welcome, Paul.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
What was the genesis for this book? I know that you have written books before. So you were probably looking for your next book, but this one, why this? Why this topic?
I think teenage boys are complex creatures, and in a couple of decades of teaching and coaching them, I've really come to appreciate the complex nature of what's going on inside of them. And I wanted to tell a story about one of them wrestling with some really heavy stuff, with some things thrown at him that were outside of his proverbial weight class, and explore the journey with him of trying to navigate those challenges and retain a sense of hope and find some redemption and continue to live his life despite everything that life had thrown at him. And so I hoped that in telling Mike's story, there would be a window for boys and for people who love boys, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their teachers, anybody who's charged with helping young people navigate this part of their lives, to help them see that even in the most complex and rugged terrain, there is a path to be found or to be made.
You said at the beginning of that, teenage boys are complex creatures. And having lived with some for the last, how long have I been living with teenagers, Janet?
Well, a long time.
A long
Some
time.
days longer than others.
Truer words were never spoken. And it's been such a fascinating journey to me because, unlike you, Paul, I was never a teenage boy. I didn't have any perspective to bring to this aside from trying to get the attention of teenage boys. And now I find some of what I thought about teenage boys then absolutely hilarious because I didn't realize they had this whole world of their own.
I like to think about the Grand Canyon as a metaphor. And I've mentioned this a few other times in speaking with groups of boys and particularly with teachers. But, you know, the Grand Canyon is it's a complex landform, but it's really subterranean. It's underground. You have to go down deep to see the depth of it. And I often think that that's kind of a fitting metaphor for the interior lives of boys and young men, and that much of it is below the surface, but it's very complex, and it's always changing too. It's being shaped sometimes slowly, but consistently by a lot of forces. So there's a lot there. And I think sometimes culture oversimplifies that to a fault. And it's very interesting to work with young guys on a daily basis and occasionally have encounters in conversation, in class and teaching, or just outside of class that really reveal that complexity, because it's pretty fascinating.
What is the doorway in, though, especially for moms of boys who want to have, I'm a family coach and I work with so many moms who long to have deep, meaningful conversations with their sons.
Well, I think many things are predicated on a presupposition of the good, and much in our culture is speaking to the opposite of that, I have worked for a very long time in Jesuit education, and one of the principles of Jesuit philosophy, which derives from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, is predicated on something called the presupposition of goodwill. And it's a little bit, I suppose, could be taken as a little bit naive and perhaps a dangerous way of going through life. But it asks us to position ourselves somewhere where we can encounter people and have a presupposition of their goodness before any judgment. And that's especially important in the face of challenging times, whether those be adolescence or unique circumstances. And so I think bearing in mind and entering into those encounters and those conversations with an awareness and a presupposition of the good and goodwill most of the time, despite consequences that sometimes don't match intentions, is very important. I think intentions matter and intentionality matters. As we're navigating adolescence, how often in a school situation do we hear, a boy say, well, that wasn't what I meant to do, or that wasn't what I meant to say. And of course, consequences matter and they need to, and actions matter, but that's not mutually exclusive of intentions. And I think having that disposition of leaving room and benefit of the doubt for those, if not perfect, but generally benevolent intentions on the part of most boys most of the time is important. I really think that is.
I think that is so huge. Janet, we've talked before about, it seems like often the cultural and societal default is boys are bad, that they are potential predators, they are potential violent offenders, that they're just, we have to rein them in so that these horrible things don't happen, instead of, Paul, this presupposition of the good. As you were talking, I